The first thing I needed to do in order to start building the roof was to build a scaffold that will support the octagonal platform that the octagonal ridge board will rest on. This is how I did it. The half-inch plywood platform was 4 feet by 4 foot, so naturally I needed a scale drawing to determine the width and depth of the top and bottom of the scaffold. Once drawn, I just took the dimensions off the drawing with an architect scale. The top and bottom came out to be 2 foot 6½ inches square. In order to get the exact height that the scaffold will be, required a scale drawing cross-section of the deck and roof. Here's the deck, the roof post, rafters, octagonal ridge board, the scaffold base, the scaffold top, and the half-inch octagonal plywood platform that the ridge board will rest on. Once drawn, I just took the dimensions off the drawing with an architect scale. The height of the 2x4 vertical members turned out to be 11 foot 4 inches. Building the top and bottom portion of the scaffold. In order to center exactly where the bottom of the scaffold needed to be placed, I laid out 2 string lines perpendicular to each other from the bottom of one roof post to the other. Then I laid down the bottom of the scaffold near the center of the gazebo deck and lined it up so that the corners lined up with the string lines. With that, I screwed it down to the deck. Building the scaffold, adding diagonal braces and plumbing the scaffold, flipping the scaffold upside down. I needed to do that in order to attach the plywood platform to the top of the scaffold. I temporarily screwed the platform onto the deck so that it wouldn't move, then placed and centered the scaffold on it and screwed them together. Then I flipped the scaffold upright and attached it to the bottom of the scaffold that I had previously centered. Finally, I checked for plumb. With that, I was certain I had the half-inch plywood platform as centered to the gazebo as I could get it. I didn't want the scaffold to sway while I was adding the rafters, so I used 1/8 inch stranded wire with turnbuckles to act as guy wires to keep the scaffold rigid. I used a swaging tool to crimp the ferrules onto the wire, making loops. Then used eye screws to attach the wires to the bottom of the 4x4 roof posts. I used turnbuckles to tighten the guy wires once they were attached to the scaffold. Initially, I'd attached the guy wires to the half-inch plywood platform, but the plywood bent when I tightened the turnbuckles, so I attached the octagonal ridge board to stiffen it. At this time, I also added the remaining 2x6s and half-inch plywood to make the ridge board 3½ inches thick. The cupola will be resting on the ridge board. Time to start adding the rafters. I doubled up on the rafters that go from the 8 roof posts to the corner of the ridge board. 2 reasons why I doubled up on the rafters. 1, I didn't know how to make the combination cut where the rafter met the ridge board on a single rafter, and 2, I wanted to be able to attach the ends of the 3/4 inch by 6 inch tongue and groove roof decking without having to toenail them at each end. Getting ready to make the combination cut for the double rafters, and screwing the double rafters together, and the double rafters attached to the ridge board. Cutting the bird's mouth. Because the rafters were doubled, I couldn't use a jigsaw. I used some angle irons I happened to have and used them as guides and made the cuts with the Sawzall. First 2 double rafters installed. I knew the 8 4x4 roof posts were not equally distanced from the ridge board. they varied within an inch or so. I individually measured each of the 8 double rafters in order to get a nice tight connection between the roof posts and the rafters. Here's how I did the measuring. First, I laid the rafter on top of the roof post. Then I rested the other end of the rafter against the ridge board. The rafter would not just lay there without holding it in place somehow, so I screwed a piece of 2x4 to the top of the rafter, then used a clamp to hold the rafter to the ridge board. With the rafter secured, I could go back to the roof post and with the straight edge mark a point on the rafter that lined up with the inside edge of the post. Note the dotted line. From that point, I drew a horizontal line. Then I used a straight edge on the outside edge of the roof post to draw a second vertical line. Where the lines intersected defined the bird's mouth. The distance from the top of the post to the top of the bird's mouth, dimension A, matched exactly the distance I wanted the rafter to drop on the ridge board after the bird's mouth was cut. Here's the position of the double rafter before the bird mouth was cut and after the cut. I performed that procedure for all 8 double rafters. That distance A was taken up by the 3/4 inch tongue and groove boards, 7/32 inch plywood, and the thickness of the shingles. The reason for the plywood was so that the nails holding down the shingles would not penetrate the 3/4 inch tongue and groove boards. I didn't want the tips of the nails showing through the ceiling. 3 of the double rafters installed, and 6, 7, and 8 installed. With the main rafters installed, I could remove the scaffolding. The double rafters and ridge board now freestanding. Now it was time to install the king rafters. Those were the single rafters in between the 2 double rafters. All the king rafters installed. Next came the jack rafters, the rafters that went from the top plate and intersected the double rafters. I drew string lines from the top plate that were 1.5 inches apart and parallel to the king rafters to see where they intersected with the double rafters. Where the 2 string lines intersected the double rafters gave me the angle I'd use to cut the jack rafter. I set that angle using a sliding T-bevel. I used another bevel to set the vertical line. I drew 2 lines, one for the cut and the other for the placement of an angle iron I used as a guide to make the combination cut with the Sawzall. I lined up the angle iron, then held it in place with 2 quick clamps. Then I screwed it down and removed the clamps. I set the rafter horizontal on my workbench, then securely held it in place with clamps. I made some guide cuts with the handsaw, and then made the final cut with a Sawzall. I pre-drilled the holes in the jack rafter to make screwing easier. Then I cleaned up the cut with the circular saw. I determined where the bird's mouth should be by using the same method that I described earlier. And this is the end result. The first jack rafter installed, and this is what it looks like with the roof framing complete.